What would you do if 6 broken, desperate women showed up at your door begging for help? But helping them meant facing the demons you've spent years running from. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about redemption, sacrifice, and the impossible choices that define who we really are. Stay with me until the end, because the decision this man makes will change not only their lives, but his own forever. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support gives me the strength to keep telling stories about courage and sacrifice. 6 young women knelt in the dry, cracked dirt outside Thaddeus Bell's ranch, their dresses torn, their faces streaked with dust, sweat, and tears. The air shimmered under the merciless sun, and the sharp scent of sagebrush mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Each breath they drew seemed to scrape their lungs raw. Yet even now, with every ounce of strength stripped from them, they refused to lie down and die. They had come too far, survived too much to let it end here. Thaddeus watched them from the shadow of his porch, his weathered hands gripping the railing so hard the sun-bleached wood groaned in protest. His throat felt like sandpaper. It had been 3 years since he'd spoken to another living soul, 3 years since he'd deliberately severed all ties with the world. And now 6 desperate figures knelt before him, their silhouettes broken against the endless fence line he'd built to keep the world out. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16. Her corn silk hair plastered to her feverish forehead. The oldest, perhaps 25, stared ahead with hollow eyes, her lips cracked and bleeding. The one with auburn hair, he thought she might have been beautiful, once raised her head slowly, and her green eyes met his. Desperation burned in their depths, a familiar desperation he'd spent years trying to erase from memory. "Please," she whispered, her voice a rasp like dry leaves in autumn. The sound barely carried across the scorched yard. Her lips trembled, but there was no more water in her body to spare for tears. She swayed, fighting to stay upright. Something inside Thaddeus shifted, a slow, dangerous stirring in the pit of his chest. He'd buried that part of himself deep, the part that felt, the part that cared. Helping people had brought him nothing but pain and ruin. He should turn his back now, retreat into the silence he'd so carefully built around himself. But he didn't. His eyes caught on the details he wished he hadn't noticed. The auburn-haired woman's dress wasn't just torn. It was shredded in places that hinted at violence. A dark stain crusted near her ribs, and when she pressed her hand, their fresh blood seeped between her fingers. The others bore similar marks, rope burns around slender wrists, bruises blooming purple and yellow on thin arms. Thaddeus clenched his jaw so tight it ached. These weren't just travelers in distress. They were victims. The auburn-haired woman struggled to her feet, swaying like a broken reed in the wind. She took a step forward, her bare feet raising small puffs of dust. "They're coming," she croaked. "Please, they're hunting us. We don't have anywhere else to go." Thaddeus felt his knuckles whiten on the railing. Hunting. The word rolled through his mind like thunder across the canyon. It brought memories he'd tried to drown another woman, another desperate plea, another time he'd chosen to do nothing. "You need to leave," he called back, his voice rusty from years of disuse. The words felt foreign, unnatural. "I can't help you." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed him. He saw them all too clearly. Their hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, the way their shoulders quivered with exhaustion. They'd already been caught once. Whatever they had escaped from it had left them bleeding, broken, but still alive. Barely. The auburn-haired woman stumbled again, clutching her side. When her knees gave out, the others cried out weakly, reaching to catch her. "Please, mister," she whispered, her voice so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. "They took our wagon 3 days back, killed our guide. Said they'd do worse if they caught us again. Her words slammed into him harder than a horse's kick. He shouldered them like a weight he hadn't asked for, but couldn't set down. The silence stretched thin as a blade between them. Then he heard it. The faint drumbeat of hooves on the hard-pan desert floor. Distant but growing closer. Multiple horses moving fast. The auburn-haired woman Clara she'd said her name was heard it too. Her green eyes widened in terror and she staggered forward. Blood-slicked fingers grasping his arm with surprising strength. "They found us," she choked out. "God help us, they found us." On the horizon, a dark smear of dust rose against the blinding blue sky. The riders would be here within the hour. Thaddeus's mind raced, calculating distances, options, consequences. 6 half-dead women couldn't outrun mounted men, but helping them meant destroying everything he'd built in 3 years of isolation. "Get them inside," he heard himself say. The words felt strange on his tongue, as though they belonged to someone else. Clara tried to shake her head. "We won't bring trouble to your door." "You'll die out here," Thaddeus growled, already moving. "And they'll find your bodies come morning. Then they'll know someone helped you." As he stepped off the porch, Thaddeus realized his hands weren't shaking. For 3 years he'd hidden from the world, but now that the world had come to him, he couldn't turn away. Not again. Thaddeus's boots thudded against the sun-baked porch as he stepped down, each stride deliberate, heavy. The women flinched at his approach like birds too battered to fly. Clara's fingers, slick with her own blood, clutched his sleeve as if she could anchor herself to his strength. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. Behind them, the desert wind shifted. Then came the sound, distant but distinct hoofbeats rolling like thunder over the horizon. Thaddeus froze. The riders were coming. Not tomorrow, not in hours, now. His eyes hardened. Whatever peace he'd built here was about to burn. Don't forget to subscribe, hit like, and comment your feelings to help spread more meaningful stories like this one. The sound of hooves grew louder, pounding across the hardpan like distant war drums. Dust bloomed on the horizon, a dirty, churning cloud that caught the late afternoon sun and glowed like fire. Whoever was coming wasn't far. They were riding hard, their pace unrelenting, and they were coming straight for the ranch. Inside, Thaddeus Bell's pulse thundered in his ears. His cabin, his fortress of silence, suddenly felt too small. The walls that had sheltered him for 3 years seemed to close in, suffocating him with memories he'd worked so hard to bury. Clara swayed on her feet beside him, one hand clutching her wounded side, blood seeping between her pale fingers. Her green eyes glassy with fever, and fear searched his face for an answer, for anything that might promise safety. "They'll be here soon," she rasped. "You should send us away. Don't let them do to you what they did to our guide." Her words barely registered. Thaddeus's mind was already moving, calculating options and distances. He'd lived alone in this valley for so long that every rock, every stretch of scrubland, every hidden trail was etched into his memory. He knew the land as well as he knew the scars on his own hands. And he knew this much: there was no place to hide out there. Not for 6 wounded women. "You'll die out there before nightfall," he said flatly, his voice low and steady, despite the storm inside him. Clara shook her head weakly. "We don't want to bring this trouble to your door, mister." Thaddeus turned to her, his jaw tightening. "It's already at my door." He didn't wait for a reply. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and began shoving the table against the door. His movements were sharp, deliberate, like a man waking from a long sleep. The others watched him wide-eyed, as if unsure whether to trust this grizzled hermit who'd first told them to leave, but now was fortifying his home against the threat bearing down on them all. "You!" he barked, pointing to a blonde girl no older than 17. Her cheeks flushed with fever. There's a jug of water in the corner. Drink but slowly. Don't make yourself sick." She stared for a moment, then obeyed, her hands trembling as she raised the jug to her cracked lips. Thaddeus's eyes swept over the others. Rope burns ringed their wrists, and bruises like fingerprints darkened their arms and throats. He felt a heat rise in his chest, not from fear this time, but from a slow, coiled rage. "Slavers," Clara whispered behind him. The word dropped like a stone in his stomach. "They bought us," she continued, her voice shaking. "From a man who promised us work. Said we'd be teachers, seamstresses, respectable work." Instead, her words caught in her throat. She gestured to her shredded dress and the deep violet bruises on her arms. "They've been tracking us since we escaped. Killed our guide when he tried to fight them. They'll do worse to you if you stand in their way." Thaddeus's grip tightened on the rifle resting by the door. The weapon felt strange in his hands after so long, but familiar enough that his fingers remembered the weight and balance. Muscle memory stirred, pulling him back to a time when he hadn't been a man of peace, when he'd been something else entirely. Through the cracked shutters, he could now make out individual riders in the dust cloud. 6 men on horseback, spreading out with military precision as they approached. One of them glinted in the sunlight. A badge. Thaddeus felt his breath hitch. His mind raced back to another badge. Another man who'd come to his home with a smile that never reached his eyes. Another time when he'd chosen not to fight and it had cost him everything. He blinked hard and forced the memory down. "You'll need to hide," he said curtly. "There's nowhere to hide," Clara replied. Her voice was calm now, almost resigned. "These men, they're thorough. They know how to find people. They won't leave until they've torn this place apart. Then I'll give them something else to think about." "You'll die," she said simply. "Maybe," he muttered, checking the rifle's chamber. "But so will they." The blonde girl coughed weakly, breaking the tense silence. Her fever-glazed eyes met his as she whispered, "We bring death wherever we go." For a moment the words hung heavy in the air. Thaddeus crouched before her, resting the rifle across his knees. "Death's been here a long time, girl," he said quietly. "But I reckon it's about to meet someone new." Outside, the hoofbeats were louder now. The riders were closing in fast. He could hear the creak of leather, the faint jingle of spurs, the low murmur of voices carried on the desert wind. Thaddeus stood, his silhouette framed by the cabin's single window. He could see them clearly now, 6 mounted men with the easy confidence of predators. The one in the lead rode with his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Even at this distance, Thaddeus could see the cold calculation in the man's posture. "Who are they?" he asked over his shoulder. "Wade Garrett." Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Federal marshal. Or he used to be. Now he sells women like cattle. And anyone who gets in his way ends up buried in the desert." Thaddeus felt his blood run cold. Garrett. A name like a ghost. A name that clawed open old wounds. He exhaled slowly and felt the weight of 3 years crash down on him. The years he'd spent in silence, punishing himself for sins he could never undo. "Not this time," he murmured. The rumble of hooves grew louder, rolling across the valley like distant thunder. Thaddeus tightened his grip on the rifle, his pulse pounding in his ears. Through the shutters he glimpsed them, 6 riders' silhouettes against the burning horizon, moving with predators' precision. Clara stirred behind him, her breath shallow. "It's him," she whispered, terror threading her voice. Wade Garrett. The name hit Thaddeus like a hammer. The man he'd buried in memory was riding straight for his door. His sanctuary was about to become a battleground. Slowly he stepped onto the porch, the sun casting long, defiant shadows at his feet. If you think this was an unforgettable journey, hit like, subscribe to catch the next part, and comment which moment left the biggest impression on you. The hoofbeat stopped. Silence stretched across the yard like a taut wire ready to snap. Dust drifted lazily in the air, catching the sun in a hazy glow as 6 riders emerged from the shimmering heat waves, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. Thaddeus Bell stood on his porch rifle in hand, watching them approach. The barrel felt heavy alien. For 3 years he'd kept his hands busy with plows and hammers, not weapons. But as the riders spread out with a predator's precision, he felt old instincts stirring. His heart drummed like a war beat, but his hands were steady. At the center of the formation rode a man in a black vest and a battered hat. The sun caught on something pinned to his chest, a federal badge that gleamed like a serpent's fang. Wade Garrett. Even at a distance, Thaddeus could see the man's posture radiating casual menace. Garrett sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his eyes cold and calculating. Afternoon friend, Garrett called, his voice carrying easily across the dry air. We're looking for some runaway property. 6 women who stole themselves from their rightful owners. You seen anyone like that around here? Behind Thaddeus? Inside the cabin? The women froze. Clara pressed a bloody hand to her mouth, stifling a cough. The youngest whimpered faintly before another pressed a hand over her mouth. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath, let it out through his nose, and answered, Haven't seen anybody. Don't get many visitors out here. Garrett's smile was as sharp as a wolf's. That's so. Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes folks hide things where they think nobody'll find them. This is private property, Thaddeus said evenly, and I don't recall inviting you to search it. A scarred brute to Garrett's right spat a wad of tobacco into the dirt and sneered. Federal authority trumps private property, hermit. You got something to hide? Thaddeus's grip tightened on the rifle. He could feel the sweat prickling at the back of his neck, though not from the desert heat. He knew these men weren't here to talk. They'd already decided he was guilty. Funny thing about hermits, Garrett said, sliding off his horse with a practiced ease. His boots crunched softly in the dust as he stepped closer. They usually hole up because they got secrets. What's yours, friend? His hand hovered casually over the grip of his revolver. The other riders followed suit, their eyes flat and predatory. Inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. It was almost imperceptible, but in the dead stillness of the desert, it was as loud as a gunshot. Garrett's head tilted, his eyes narrowing. What was that? Thaddeus replied flatly. Loose board in the roof. But Garrett's smirk deepened. Wind doesn't sound like footsteps. He took another step closer, the wooden porch creaking under his weight. Boys, he called over his shoulder. I think our hermit's been keeping secrets. Let's have us a proper look inside. The 5 men dismounted in perfect unison, their movements sharp and efficient. This wasn't a ragtag gang of outlaws. These were professionals. Hunters. Garrett reached for the cabin door, his gloved fingers curling around the handle. That's far enough, Thaddeus said, his voice low but steady. Garrett froze his eyes, flashing with curiosity and amusement. Slowly, he looked down. The barrel of Thaddeus's rifle was aimed squarely at his chest. The yard went still. 6 revolvers came up as one aimed at Thaddeus. But his rifle didn't waver. You're making a mistake, friend, Garrett said softly. A big one. Those women belong to us, bought and paid for. You're interfering with legal commerce. Legal Thaddeus's laugh was sharp and bitter. Slavery's been outlawed for years, even out here. They ain't slaves, Garrett countered smoothly. Indentured servants. Contracts and all. Lies. Clara's voice rang out from inside the cabin, hoarse but fierce. We never signed anything. He drugged us, took us from a church social in Kansas. Garrett's face darkened at the sound of her voice. Sounds like you got stolen property in there, friend. Property that's making you stupid. The moment stretched like glass about to shatter. You know what I think? Garrett continued, his voice dropping to a purr. I think you got history with situations like this. Maybe you failed to help someone once before, and now you're trying to make up for it. Touched a nerve, didn't I? Thaddeus's knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. What was her name? Garrett pressed. Wife, sister, daughter. Someone you let die while you hid behind your walls? Her name was Sarah. Thaddeus said, his voice cracking like dry timber. She was my wife, and I won't make the same mistake twice. Garrett's smile turned cruel. Sarah Bell. I remember her. Pretty thing. She called for you while we took her, called your name when she died, wondered why her brave husband didn't come. The words sliced through Thaddeus like a blade. For a heartbeat, the rifle shook in his hands, not from fear but from rage, boiling hot and uncontrollable. Then a new voice cut through the tension, carrying from the cabin like a lifeline. He's lying, Clara said, her voice trembling but strong. Sarah fought to the end. She broke one man's nose, gouged another's eye. And when she died, she wasn't calling your name. She was cursing his. Garrett's confident smile faltered. Thaddeus's vision narrowed to a single point, Garrett's heart. You killed her, Thaddeus growled. You killed her, Garrett spat back. By being too yellow to fight. Not this time. The rifle roared. Garrett flew backward, his badge flashing one last time in the sun before he hit the dirt. The yard erupted into chaos. Do you think Thaddeus made the right choice? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you enjoyed the story, and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. The rifle's roar shattered the silence, echoing across the valley like a thunderclap. Wade Garrett flew backward off the porch, his black vest blooming red as he hit the ground with a sickening thud. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. Then chaos erupted. Boss, one of the riders, screamed. 6 revolvers came up as one, muzzles flashing in the harsh sunlight. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the porch railing, shattering windows, and filling the dry desert yard with smoke and the stench of gunpowder. Thaddeus dove behind the old water trough as lead whined past his ears. He worked the lever on his rifle with practiced speed, his body moving before his mind could catch up. 3 years of isolation hadn't dulled the instincts of a man who'd once lived by the gun. Inside the cabin, Clara's voice rang out, hoarse but steady. The root cellar. There's weapons under the floor. The door slammed open, and Clara staggered into the sunlight, clutching a double-barreled shotgun. Her dress was soaked with blood, but her hands were steady. She fired both barrels at the nearest rider. The blast knocked him off his horse, his body hitting the dirt with a dull crunch. Get down, Thaddeus shouted, slamming another round into the chamber. A bullet whined past his head, so close he felt the heat of it graze his cheek. He took aim and squeezed the trigger. Another rider jerked violently as the bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. The remaining men spread out, firing as they moved, trying to pin Thaddeus and the women. Their shouts cut through the smoke-filled air like the cries of hunting wolves. Suddenly, the cabin door banged open again. The other 5 women emerged, clutching rifles and pistols pulled from Thaddeus's hidden arsenal. They moved like wounded animals, forced to fight, their faces pale, but their eyes burning with defiance. The youngest, Grace, still burning with fever, rested a rifle on the windowsill. Her thin arm shook as she pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but the sound alone sent one of the horses rearing in panic. Thaddeus shouted over the din, aim low. Take the horses, if you can't hit the men. Clara reloaded with trembling hands and fired again, the recoil nearly knocking her to her knees. Another rider screamed as her shot tore into his leg, and he crumpled into the dust. The tide was turning, but the fight wasn't over. One of Garrett's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, charged straight for the porch, firing wildly. "Drop your guns or I'll burn this place to the ground," he roared. "Like hell," Thaddeus muttered. He rose from behind the trough and fired. The brute's eyes went wide in shock before he toppled forward, his body sliding lifeless from the horse. The two remaining riders exchanged a glance. They hadn't expected this. 6 half-dead women and a broken hermit weren't supposed to fight back. Now 2 of their men were dead and the others bleeding in the dirt. "Fall back," one shouted. "Not without the women," the other growled. But hesitation was death in a gunfight. Clara stepped out from the doorway, blood streaking her face and hair. Her voice carried like a whip crack across the yard. "Run while you still can, or join your friends in the dirt." For a split second, the men wavered. Then Thaddeus fired again, the bullet punching through the hat of the lead rider. The man let out a panicked curse and yanked his horse's reins hard. The 2 survivors wheeled their mounts and bolted, kicking up a cloud of dust as they fled toward the horizon. Silence descended heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the women and the distant pounding of retreating hooves. Thaddeus lowered his rifle slowly, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the blood-soaked dirt. Wade Garrett lay sprawled in the dust, his badge glinting dully in the sun. Kneeling beside the body, Thaddeus stared down at the man who had haunted his nightmares for 3 long years. The man who had stolen everything from him. It was over. But the victory felt hollow. "Sarah's still gone," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Clara limped over, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She knelt beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "She'd be proud of you," she said softly. "Proud you finally fought back." Thaddeus swallowed hard, his throat burning. His eyes lifted to the women standing in the doorway, bleeding, battered, but alive. Grace leaned heavily on the doorframe, her fever-bright eyes locked on him. "You saved us," she whispered. Thaddeus shook his head slowly. "No, you saved yourselves. I just gave you a chance." For a moment, time froze. Garrett's cruel smile faltered as the cold steel of Thaddeus's rifle pressed against his chest. 6 guns in the yard clicked in unison, cocked and ready to fire. The sun blazed overhead, baking the earth, and a bead of sweat slid down Thaddeus's temple. Then, like a crack of lightning, he pulled the trigger. The rifle roared. Garrett flew backward, blood blooming across his vest. Chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the porch. Wood splintered, windows shattered, and Thaddeus dove for cover, knowing the battle for all their lives had begun. The last echoes of gunfire faded into the desert wind, leaving only silence and the smell of smoke. Thaddeus lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving as the weight of what had just happened settled on him. Around him, the women stood, battered, bloodied, but alive. Clara leaned against the doorway, clutching her side, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and awe. For the first time in 3 years, Thaddeus felt the crushing walls around his heart begin to crumble. The fight was over. But in that silence, a question lingered. What now? What now? Let's spread this story together. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and drop a comment below. Your opinion matters and helps us create even better stories in the future. The ranch yard was still. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mingling with the copper tang of blood. The setting sun bathed the valley in molten gold, casting long shadows across the dirt, where Wade Garrett's body lay motionless, his badge half buried in dust. Thaddeus Bell knelt beside the man who had haunted his nightmares for 3 long years. Garrett's sightless eyes stared skyward, his smirk gone, replaced by the slack-jawed stillness of death. It was over. But the victory felt hollow. For a moment, Thaddeus's hands shook, not from fear or adrenaline, but from the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. He could still hear Sarah's laughter in the back of his mind, as fragile and fleeting as the desert wind. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget her face. Now, in Garrett's death, she came rushing back in vivid, heartbreaking clarity. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry it took me so long." A soft rustling behind him drew his attention. Clara limped forward, her dress torn and blood-stained, her auburn hair matted to her face. She knelt beside Thaddeus, her fingers brushing his arm with surprising gentleness. "She'd be proud of you," Clara said quietly. "Sarah, she believed in you, right to the end." Thaddeus's throat constricted. He looked at Clara, at the haunted green eyes of a woman who'd endured horrors and survived. She wasn't just speaking words of comfort. He could see in her face that she meant them. His gaze drifted to the cabin where the other women stood framed in the doorway. Grace, the fevered girl, leaned weakly against the jamb, but her blue eyes were sharp with something he hadn't seen before Hope. The others hovered protectively around her, bruised and battered, but alive. "You saved us," Grace whispered. Thaddeus shook his head slowly. "No, you saved yourselves. I just gave you the chance." A breeze swept across the yard, stirring the dust, carrying with it the faint scent of wild sage. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt peaceful. 6 months later, the sun rose over a small, bustling settlement in the New Haven territory. A one-room schoolhouse stood proudly at the edge of town, its windows catching the morning light, its fresh timber walls glowing warmly. Thaddeus wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned on the hammer in his hand, surveying his work. Every board, every nail, every pane of glass had passed through his calloused hands. He'd built this place for them, with the same care and precision he'd once used to build the walls around his heart. "Looks sturdy enough to survive a tornado," Clara said behind him. He turned to see her approaching, her steps steady now, her dress clean and pressed. Her green eyes sparkled in the sunlight, no longer dulled by pain or fear. "Sturdy enough for a bunch of wild children, at least." Thaddeus replied, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Clara tilted her head, studying him. "You never told me why you stayed." Thaddeus glanced at the schoolhouse, at the 6 women who had come here broken, but now stood whole and proud. Grace, taller now and full of energy, was helping younger children arrange books on shelves. The others laughed and chatted as they swept floors and dusted desks. "Maybe I got tired of hiding," he said finally. "Or maybe I found something worth standing for." Clara's smile softened. "You're a hard man to figure out, Thaddeus Bell." "Good. Keep it that way," he teased. But his hand reached for hers, and she didn't pull away. They married in the spring, on a morning when the desert bloomed with wildflowers. Clara wore Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band polished until it gleamed. She wore it not as a replacement for the woman Thaddeus had lost, but as a symbol that some loves were strong enough to bless new beginnings. After the ceremony, as the townsfolk celebrated and children ran laughing through the grass, Thaddeus stepped aside for a moment, gazing out across the open plains. The wind shifted, whispering through the sagebrush. For a heartbeat, he could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice, soft, warm, proud. "You did good," she seemed to say. Thaddeus closed his eyes, the breeze tugging gently at his hair. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on his chest eased. "I hope so," he whispered back. Behind him, Clara called his name. He turned, and for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. At its core, this story is about redemption, courage, and the enduring power of human connection. Thaddeus Bell's journey from a broken, guilt-ridden recluse to a man willing to risk everything for others shows us that even the deepest wounds can heal when we choose to act with compassion and bravery. It reminds us that solitude may protect us from pain, but it also denies us the chance to make a difference in the lives of others and in our own. The 6 women, though battered and haunted by their suffering, embody resilience and the refusal to surrender to cruelty. Their determination to escape a life of enslavement reflects the universal human yearning for freedom and dignity. Together with Thaddeus, they demonstrate that no matter how powerless we feel, standing up against injustice, even when the odds seem impossible, can change everything. The story also highlights how confronting our past, no matter how painful, is often the only way to find peace. Thaddeus's final stand is not just against Wade Garrett, but against his own fear and regret. In choosing to fight, he not only saves the women, but also reclaims the part of himself he thought had died with his wife. Ultimately, the message is clear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Healing comes not from isolation, but from love, sacrifice, and finding the strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with guns, but with the courage to face your past, the strength to stand for what's right, and the faith to believe that even in the ruins of loss, a new beginning can rise like the desert sun. Let's spread this story together. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, and drop a comment below. Your opinion matters and helps us create even better stories in the future.